Part 2. At Hill 304 and Motlab. March 14th, 1917. Our last day at Jubacore. At last the good news has come. Tomorrow morning we are to end this lazy existence and take Section 1's place at Damblay. This afternoon, the medicine chef piled 10 of us into 2 ambulances and took us over some roads north of Damblay, which we will use in our work there. A few miles from Jubacore, we found ourselves in a thick wood which my map called Bois d'Avocat. Soon we veered off sharply to the left, onto a bumpy road where there was barely room for 2 cars to pass. All the camions and munition wagons are forced to use it because the Boches have the exact range of the main route and pepper it continually. Suddenly, as we were passing a couple of bomb-proofs or abris, a terrific explosion sounded behind us, and for a minute we thought it was a Boche shell arriving. But 3 more bangs followed shortly, and we soon learned that it was a battery of 155s at work. Here we were, literally on top of a battery of 6-inch guns which the Germans battered daily, as we could tell by the splintered trees and numerous shell holes. Yet they were so cleverly concealed that even when they were fired, all that we could see was the flame from the mouth of the gun. We went on to 3 or 4 postes de secours, to which we will come soon for 24-hour stretches, waiting for wounded and carrying them when they arrive to some hospital 10 or 12 miles in the rear. At one place about a mile from the front-line trenches, where we stopped for a few minutes, Crowhurst and Faith stumbled into a pile of heavy iron balls with queer caps attached. They carried 3 or 4 along for several miles, only to learn later from one of the Frenchmen that they were hand grenades, and would explode in 8 seconds after the cap was touched. Here and there we encountered a fresh shell hole in the road, and even oftener the traces of an old one, which had been filled with crushed stone. Luckily, no shells fell near us today, but the fellows in another car who took a different road said they had some narrow escapes. I found out later that they always tell you this. We held an informal reception in the barn tonight after the rat hunt. Some of the Frenchmen in the village dropped in and told several mighty interesting stories about their experiences in the war. I couldn't understand a great deal, but I remember they talked a lot about the inside story of the Second Battle of Verdun, and the sacrifices the French made to keep Douaumont and Vaux. Then they switched to the very beginning of the war, when the Germans first violated the Red Cross laws by concealing machine guns in their ambulances and driving them up to no man's land, seemingly to collect wounded after an attack. After this, ambulances were not allowed to go up to the first lines. I only wish that I knew more French, for there were lots of interesting points that I missed entirely. When the party finally broke up, Benny and I went outside to watch the star shells bursting 9 miles away, around Avocat and Hill 304. It is quite a sight to watch them shoot up into the heavens, break forth in a brilliant magnesium light, and then slowly descend in a parachute until the flame dies down. I don't suppose we will be so fond of them, though, when we get in among them. Some Titusville heralds came today, and I enjoyed the rural news especially. If I recall correctly, Samantha Babbs of Porky had an earache, and the Royal Order of Oil Creek Township Owls had their annual meeting. Wiener sandwiches and sauerkraut were served by the young ladies of the female department. St. Patrick's Day. Damblay-en-Argonne. I am sitting before a fire in our quarters. It is quite a hot one, for I have just put on the legs of an old oak bedstead and the polished top of a wrecked mahogany writing desk. They burn well and make it much pleasanter here than it was at Jubacore. Besides, ours is the best house remaining in the village. Practically all of the others fell in ruins during a heavy bombardment last fall. With the exception of a few road menders, we are the sole occupants of the place. The peasants were all forced to flee after the shelling. I understand that the Germans still punish it quite regularly. Naturally, our life here ought to be interesting. When we arrived last Thursday, all of Section 1's cars were lined up in the road opposite the cantonment, and we had barely time to say hello before they were speeding down the road towards Vadelincourt. They will be en repos there for a couple of weeks. Then came a general scramble for rooms. Bradley and I stuck together and found a wonderful little shack behind the main building. We didn't have possession long, however, for our French lieutenant had previously chosen it, and we were forced to give it up to him. We tried the parlor of the big house after this. It was pretty good, except that the ceiling had recently fallen and left several inches of debris on the floor. But this was fine compared to the rooms some of the other fellows had. We went vigorously to work and in 2 hours had a fairly respectable place for our stretchers. Just after we had finished, 2 slackers joined us and we ended with a merry party of 6 in our parlor. Yesterday morning, Aunt Con was on duty at Montseville, and I went out with him to learn the road. It is sort of a relay or halfway post between Damblay and N. And although N is 1.5 miles closer to the trenches, still Montseville gets a good many blessés from the batteries and engineers' posts nearby. The town is in a much worse condition than Damblay. Hardly a wall remains, and the few soldiers who stay in the place live deep underground in abri. We left Ott's blanket roll in the poste de secours, and then climbed out into the open again to look around a little. We had just emerged when a terrific screech like the tearing of an enormous piece of cloth sounded above us. A violent explosion occurred in the road in front of us, and little stones and éclats came pattering down all around, but not before we had tumbled headlong down the abri entrance and were safe underground once more. 3 more shells fell outside, and then, when nothing else happened for some time, we got our nerve back again and crawled slowly out. We poked around the ruins for a while until we got some distance from the post. Here on top of a pile of stones, once the walls of a little cottage, we gazed at the distant summit of a hill where French shells were breaking instead of German, for the enemy held the crest. This was the famous Mortram. Craig stopped by soon after this on his way to N, and since Ott was on 24-hour duty here and there was no point in my staying with him, I went on with Craig to learn the road. It was late in the afternoon when we got started. Immediately upon leaving the village, we came into plain sight of the trenches. However, it happened that we were seen far more clearly by the enemy than we could possibly see him. We had to drive over an exposed road along the brow of a hill, with the fields on either side of us speckled with shell holes. Opposite us were the Boche trenches, showing up in thin, white lines, which were occasionally marked by a puff of smoke from an exploding 75. I experienced the same shivery feeling here which one often has at home before getting up to make a speech in school. You try to tell yourself everything is all right, but still you seem to quiver all over. However, from the glances I stole at Craig now and then, I knew that he was just as worked up as I was. This idea seemed to cheer me immensely, and I felt much more at ease afterwards. We drove into N, the little town where we have our poste de secours, just after sunset, and what had once been peaceful homes rose before us in shattered walls and ugly piles of stones. In the whole place there was no building with its sides still intact, and very few which had any walls at all. It can never hope to be rebuilt. We were forced to drive slowly through the town, for barbed wire, waiting to be hauled to the trenches, lay about in huge piles, sometimes projecting out into the street. And big logs, to be used for dugout supports, were scattered about. 6 fresh shell holes and an occasional arrivée 100 yards or so away added to the pleasure of the trip. We finally got to the old chateau, where the post is located, and had barely climbed out of the car when one of the stretcher-bearers met us and said 2 couchés were waiting. We carefully put them in, the brancardier helping, and then in the dusk drove back with them to the hospital at Ville. Craig went pretty slowly, in fact, the whole distance in low speed, but the poor chaps moaned all the way. Clark certainly has had hard luck. Last night he was driving along the Post 2 road in the Bois d'Avocat when he got stuck in a bad mud hole and had to wait there 3 hours before any help came. Just as he started on his way again, a 210 exploded in the road, 40 feet in front of him, splashed mud all over him, and shook the whole car. He stopped and sat there shaking, he said, for 5 or 10 minutes. Finally, he got his nerve back and went on to Ville de Couzance to the HOE. And after all this, when he was sitting before the fire in his quarters tonight, his roommate accidentally kicked over a pail of boiling water resting on the coals. Most of it spilled on Clark's feet, and before they could get his socks off, he was badly burned. He will probably be laid up for a month in the hospital. March 20th. In the Abri of the Poste de Secours at N. A little after noon on Sunday, the heaviest bombardment we have yet heard started from our nearby batteries. Every one of them, from the 75s to the 380s, banged away for all it was worth, and until midnight there was scarcely a second's interval between the shells. This was the tir de barrage, the preliminary to a big attack, which we first thought was French, but which afterwards turned out to be Boche against Hill 304 and Mortam. This naturally meant a lot of work for us, and in the middle of the afternoon 6 or 7 cars were called out and all the others were made ready to leave. 4 is the usual number sent out for our 24-hour stretches, 3 at their posts and 1 on call. My own turn came at 11 o'clock, when the work was getting heavier. They gave me the N run, the one I had made with Craig, and where I am now, waiting until a full load of blessés arrive. Of course we could use no lights, and as the road was constantly being shelled, I felt rather nervous. We had been somewhat worked up that afternoon when Craig came in from Post 2, having seen 10 men shot to pieces just 100 yards in front of him in the Bois d'Avocat. And Haven turned up a little later with a tale of a similar happening in another place. Furthermore, there had been a big gas attack earlier in the afternoon, and 4 or 5 of the fellows had been compelled to wear their masks. With these pleasant little stories to cheer me, I left our cantonment. I could not see the road, only an undefined streak a shade lighter than the surroundings, and I drove very slowly at first and blew my whistle at every dark spot on the horizon. Sometimes these turned out to be trees, but more often they were wagons bearing ammunition and supplies to the communicating trenches, from which they are carried forward either by men or burros. It was very hard to see them, and I had many close calls, not only from collision, but also from breaking my rear axle in the fresh shell holes between Monseville and N. I stopped for a moment at the former post and found McLean there. He had run into a huge log, obstructing the road between the 2 posts, and had come back here to get help. Word had been sent to Crowhurst, the mechanic, who came out in Houston's car. He arrived just after I did, and as we were entering the abri, a shrapnel broke overhead and threw mud and éclat down the doorway. 8 or 10 more shells fell in the town while I was there, and since they seemed to be after the convoys of ammunition caissons which flew by on a gallop, I also kept up a pretty good speed until I was out of the place. When I passed McLean's car, there was a shrapnel hole in the cowl and a piece of éclat in the radiator. Logs were scattered all along the road, and the shell holes became more and more numerous. I managed to get to the chateau finally and found 3 Grands Blessés waiting for me outside. I drove very slowly and carefully on my return trip, but sometimes I struck a bad hole which I hadn't seen, and the poor fellows moaned and shrieked pathetically. I managed to get them into D'Amblay finally. Here I found there was no one to relay them on to the hospital at Ville, and that I would have to take them myself. So I continued on through Brocourt and Jubecourt to the HOE at Ville, where I left my wounded. Then I went back to N again for more, and kept on working until 4 o'clock the next afternoon. I didn't sleep for 35 hours, and some of the men, those who had been on duty before, went 4 or 5 hours more than this. Well, there were a lot of fresh shell holes just outside of N on one of my trips the next afternoon. I certainly prayed as I passed them with my load of couchés that God would help me back safely, at least to bring my car back without disaster. And I am sure my prayer was answered, for 5 of our cars were broken down that night, and 4 the next, some of them rather seriously. 2 machines ran into ammunition wagons, and 4 collided in the woods. There were also several minor accidents, such as running head-on into a stone wall or having a rear wheel drop off. Of course, this seems like a good many, but I really think we were fortunate in not having any more trouble than we did. You can't expect to come out untouched on roads like these, which make the worst stretch at home seem like the Lincoln Highway, and with 15 cars out at once, the majority of them driven by inexperienced drivers. Furthermore, the night was pitch black, and much of the way lay through thick woods. Then there were the lovely star shells which come up every minute or so, and after lighting up the whole landscape for 8 or 10 seconds, die out and leave you half blinded by the glare. The result of our 2 days' work, ending Tuesday night, was 377 wounded, carried a total distance of 10,000 kilometers. Both sides suffered severely, but very little ground changed hands. And when the whole affair was over, the first-line trenches were nothing except a mass of shell holes, and in many places only 15 feet apart. I have finally seen what I came over for, and a lot more besides. War, real war, stripped of glory. For what chance has a man against a shell? And how does the awful suffering of trench life compare with the thrilling battles of the Revolution? I don't mean that it doesn't take 10 times the nerve and the endurance, but there's the rub, for we have become machines, not men. I know God will protect us over here, but you realize how absolutely weak and helpless you are when a load of dead are brought in, some with arms and legs gone, others with heads and trunks mixed together, and quite often you learn there wasn't anything left to bring. This matter of being under shell fire for the first time and of trying to drive back in the dark from N gives one a queer feeling. Payne told me on the boat coming over that he wasn't a Christian and that he didn't believe in prayer. But he said to me yesterday that he had prayed for the first time in his life out there on the N road. Just as he was rounding Kelly's Corner, a 77 landed in the road in front of him. When 2 more shells came, one in the field to his right and the other a few yards behind him. Why, Dooley, he said afterwards, there wasn't anything else to do except to pray. I felt so little, so absolutely helpless, that I had to ask God for help. I got it, too. That 4th shell didn't explode. March 24th. D'Emblay once again. I crawled into my blankets here at 3 o'clock this morning. They sent me out about 10 last evening on a special call to Post 2. I had 3 runs down to Ville with some blessés from a German coupe de main, and this kept me going for some time. Fortunately, there was a full moon, or I would have had a terrible time in the woods. I had just enough pep to get up for breakfast, and then was sorry that I did afterwards. It was pouring in torrents outside, and the old dining room leaked like a sieve. There was nothing to do but put on our raincoats and stand there in that deluge, trying to swallow a plate of half-cooked oatmeal. I am afraid that our meals will be below par for a few days. André, the cook, lucky fellow, has gone to Paris on his permission, and one of the truck drivers has taken his place. His first meal wasn't much of a success. At last, Section 12 has a mascot. Henny Houston stopped at Jubecourt today on his way back from Ville and got a little mongrel pup from his old friend Abigail in the épicerie there. It was baptized after lunch with the name of Monseville. Such a cute name for a dog. Cookie calls our habitation on D'Emblay Alley the den of thieves, and he certainly is right. One would think we had been brought up along with Bill Sykes in Fagin's den. Our development into kleptomaniacs began when Ott Kahn hid underneath his bed about 50 pounds of time fuses and unexploded hand grenades which he had picked up near N. We found out about it the same day the poor brancardier was killed, fooling with a grenade at Monseville, and it made us sort of nervous to see Ott sitting on his stretcher evenings, banging away on his dainty little souvenirs with hammer and chisel. He appeared quite unconcerned, but we weren't. The first time he tried it, the grating sound of the steel upon the brass and iron and the thought of what might happen if he struck a cap caused us to implore him to stop. Finally, since Ott was immovable, we all turned in, hoping that, if the thing did explode, we would miss most of the fragments because we were lying down. Ott went to Post 2 on the following day, and before he returned, his relics were resting comfortably at the bottom of a neighboring well. He immediately suspected Bradley, who was really innocent of the trick, and hid 2 of his 3 blankets just as the latter was starting for N on 24-hour duty. Bradley almost froze that night at the chateau, and planned vengeance upon his return. Supposing Barney to be the guilty party, from something that he had heard Ott say, he stole his shoes and a dozen packages of cigarettes which Barney had borrowed from Ott's suitcase the day before. Of course, this complicated matters, and not even our stretchers were safe after this. My mirror, my sewing kit, and all my toilet articles disappeared one by one, only to reappear a few days later on Cookie's shelf or tucked away among Aunt's blankets. Strange to say, it was a dull loss. Several times I have gone to bed with 3 blankets over me and found 5 there in the morning, and not a soul in the room would know anything about it. If Crowhurst makes a little paper cutter out of a compression band, or perhaps a salt and pepper shaker from a Bosch machine gun bullet, and we feel that it would mean more to us than it would to him, we persuade ourselves that it is really ours and get possession of it at the first opportunity. We thought at first this kleptomania was confined to our own room, but it has spread throughout the section, even to the plutocrats across the street. Stealing has become almost a virtue, as it was with the Spartans. You are a wonder if you can get away with it. But whatever happens, don't get caught. Barney Faith and I laid in a supply of wood this afternoon, which ought to last us a month. But it is still pretty cold, and Bradley and Cook keep the fireplace so well filled up that we have to have 2 or 3 cords on hand all the time. We keep it stacked up in the corner where the piano used to be. The 2 of us ran my ambulance down the street to the wreck of an old mansion, filled the back chuck full of banister pickets, assorted furniture and wainscoting which we tore from the walls, and carried it back to our 1-room apartment on the hill. It is 20 minutes to 10, and we are still sitting around the fire. Crow pulled out his mouth organ a little while again and is playing every ragtime he can think of. Cook has just received a long-expected check from home and is so happy about it that he is practicing a clog dance on Ott Khan's bed. Ott is on duty at Post 3. Brass time fuse from a German 77 3-inch shell. 1. The time fuse assembled, ready to be screwed onto the shell proper. 2. The top of the fuse, which contains the spring and fulminate of mercury cap. The latter explodes from inertia on leaving the gun. 3. First ring, with groove filled with powder, which burns until it comes to hole in 4. It is ignited by the explosion of the cap in 2. 4. Second ring, also filled with powder, which is ignited from 3, and which burns as far as the unit indicated on ring. This ring is set for the second at which it is desired that the shell shall explode over the enemy's lines. 5. Base of time fuse. Upper part contains trigger and lower part tube through which the flame passes, which explodes the shell itself. 6. The covering over last part of passage. Photo caption 1. The anti-aircraft 75 on the hill in St. Manhold. The audiphone consists of a phonograph horn, a long hose, and a set of tightly strung wires. With this apparatus, an enemy aeroplane motor can be heard 10 miles away. Photo caption 2. St. Manhold schoolboys watching the gun above shelling a German plane 12,000 feet above the city. Photo caption 3. Our apartments in St. Manhold. The stretcher with its regulation iron neck and ankle rest is covered with blankets full of little things. The 4 basins are used for developing pictures. Photo caption 1. Children scrambling for little American flags, which we are tossing down to them from the barn window. Photo caption 2. Young Monsieur Delige and his sister Suzanne. He is wearing his dress suit, for he has just taken his first communion. Photo caption 3. A section of a hospital train. Each compartment holds 4 stretcher cases. March 26th. N. The wine cellar of the old chateau. I stumbled into the morgue last night when I was trying to locate one of the brancardiers out behind the chateau. It had been clear all evening, and a beautiful moon was rising above the hills towards Montseville. But its rays were not beautiful within the morgue. They showed far too clearly the mangled limbs and bodies of a dozen Frenchmen who had been brought down from Mont the night before. Here a rough gunny sack covered the decapitated trunk of a young machine gunner, and alongside it lay the abdomen and legs of another poor poilu whose feet had already rotted away before a kind Boche shell put him out of his misery. Bouvier told me several of them had been stuck in the mud out there for 3 days after the attack, and although unwounded when shells were breaking all around them, they had died of hunger and exposure. People at home think that we are making tremendous sacrifices to come over here and do this work. But they are nothing compared to those which the simple, uneducated poilu makes. When I was little, I used to spend hours over stories of wars in Egypt and France, in England and Russia, and I have thought since then how little truth there was in any of them. The fact that the war had been fought often being the only reasonably true statement. The poilus have started on the same plan, and I presume in 10 years a number of books on exaggerated myths of the present war will be on sale. Nevertheless, their tales are interesting and usually very exciting. We were all gathered in the abri at the post and inn last night, 7 Brancardier and Lefebvre and myself, when one of them sprung this story. He called it How the Crown Prince Came to... He says the affair occurred early in 1915, when the war was still young and crossing the lines was not so difficult as it is now. It happened that the Boches were hammering away at Verdun as usual and were planning their big spring offensive. If they could get all of Hill 304 and Mortham, besides Forts Douaumont and Vaux, the game would almost be up for the French on the entire salient. So one dark night in February, the Crown Prince, who wasn't quite sure what forces the French had in this sector, decided to dash across himself in his staff car, shoot down over the hill into N, and get some information from one of the general's staff, a major in the French army who was, of course, a spy. The old road from Montfaucon to N was pretty badly torn by shell fire at that time, but there wasn't a single trench cut through it. They were all burrowed under it. And as for barbed wire, they weren't using any yet on the hill. The prince and 2 of his intimate friends, dressed in French officers' uniforms and driving a baby Peugeot of Parisian manufacture, crossed the lines in a drizzling rain about midnight after a scouting party had given the circuit signal. They bounced from one shell crater to another down the narrow, winding road into the village, but they got to the chateau all right, where the headquarters were then. The 3 men entered the chateau, conferred with the major in his private abri, and afterwards joked and drank healths with the other officers in the main apartment. But they stayed a trifle too long. The wine had its effect, and the Crown Prince began to get a little careless with his French. But only one man had noticed it, for all the others were happy too. This was the sergeant on guard at the door. He tried to whisper in the commandant's ear, but the old fellow pushed him away, and the colonel wouldn't even look at him. Suddenly the major entered, said that a message had come for the guests, and would they please step outside for a moment. This was the last that was ever seen of them at N. But they know that the car carried 4 men back to Germany instead of the 3 which it brought over, and the sergeant was court-martialed for not telling the colonel before it was too late. March 28th, 1917. D'Amblay-en-Argonne. It is a few minutes before midnight. I have just returned from my 24 hours, which stretched into 30 this time, at Monceville and N. I dropped asleep last evening in the abri at the former place, and when I awoke early this morning I found myself lying fully dressed on a pile of straw with no blankets over me. Naturally, I hadn't slept very well, but I felt I had been lucky not to have been called out at 2 or 3 o'clock. At 7 I went over to the Poste de Secours abri and had breakfast with the Brancardiers. They are the same men who were here last week, except that there is one missing. Jean Picot, I think his name was, had his hand blown off recently by a grenade which he was trying to unload. He was evacuated to Ville-sur-Couzance, but the chances for his recovery are very slight. Monsieur Guérin, the dapper little adjutant, is still here. As usual, he talked to me in English, and I answered each time in French. He is quite serious about it, and corrects all of my mistakes very carefully. Across the street from us was one of the army telephone exchanges. I watched them for some time this morning as they were trying to connect Dead Man's Hill, dugout number 27, with a busy colonel's quarters in the Bois de Besseville. I couldn't make a great deal out of the conversation, so I soon left them and went into their kitchen. A middle-aged man with a rough, black beard stood beside the stove, which happened to be one of the regulation army kitchen wagons placed in one corner of the room. I shouted, "Bonjour, monsieur," at him 2 or 3 times before he heard me. Finally, he turned around and looked me over very carefully. Then, I think someone must have told him that an American section was nearby. He burst out with, "Well, I'll be darned! You are the first person from the States I have seen for 18 months. What's your hometown, anyway?" He said it all so fast that I could not make him out for a minute. But I came to shortly, and then it was my turn to ask questions. He told me that he had gone to America when he was 17, and settled in New York City. For some years, along with another Frenchman, he had conducted a well-known hairdressing establishment on Fifth Avenue. When the war broke out, he had debated for some time whether he ought to leave his family or not. But finally, he couldn't stand it any longer, and so it happened that he sailed back to France in the fall of 1914. We got into a long conversation. He wanted to know all about America and what had happened there lately, and I was trying to find out more about him. Then, in order to cement our friendship, he offered me a cup of coffee flavored with a spoonful of their terrible cognac. It took a long time to get it down, for it choked me if I swallowed much at once. But accepting his love for cognac and eau de vie, he was a fine chap. I promised to look him up the next time I came to Montseville. At 4 o'clock I rode up to N with only an occasional shell dropping near. But the French were peppering Morton, and I hurried along in order to get to the chateau before the Boche began to reply. 15 or 20 shells dropped around the post a few minutes after I arrived, but I was in the abri at that time. Chauvenet has just come in from post 2. On his way out, a 210 landed in the middle of the road just in front of his car, and a great piece of steel tore through the top of his car not 10 inches from his head, and dropped into the back of the ambulance. He did not know that the car had been touched until half an hour later, for he was so stunned by the force of the explosion, and so overcome by the gases of the shell through which he was forced to ride, that he barely got out alive. Everyone is envious and wishes that it had happened to him. At least they say so. I picked up a chap near Brocourt today who was on his way back to Mortam after his permission. He had walked all the way from Bar-le-Duc that day and was all tired out. He was mighty glad to get the ride, for he had orders to be back in his company before midnight. We talked for a while in jerky little sentences, I using the usual "n'est-ce pas" and "comprenez-vous," and he always relying on "c'est la guerre" for an answer to my questions. At one place we passed a flock of strange birds. I pointed to them and mumbled something to signify that I wanted to know what they were. He simply said "oiseau," and I replied as well as I could that we didn't have any oiseaux in America. He looked rather surprised and muttered something about having always heard that États-Unis was a queer sort of place. I discovered when I got back to the cantonment that the word oiseau means bird. Cook relieved me at 9 o'clock, saying that 3 big boys had fallen near him as he passed through Montseville. This was a pleasant send-off, and I pictured a delightful little journey back to D'Amblay. But the stars were out when I started, and a sprinkling of snow upon the ground made it very easy to keep on the road. I had only one blessé, for things were quiet in the trenches today. March 30th. D'Amblay again. Harry came in at 4 this morning and got Crowhurst and me out of bed. Haven's car had broken down near N, and we were to go out in 464 to fix it. Cohen went along with us. We found it straddling an old stone wall not far from the post. He had wandered off the road and run square into it when a star shell went out and left him in total darkness. The front axle was badly bent, and the triangle rod was almost tied in a knot. Of course, we couldn't straighten the axle, but we put in a new rod in the dark and managed to tow the car home. The blessés with which he had started out had in the meanwhile been transferred to another car and taken to Ville. Thursday night the blessés from the morning attack began to pile in at N. I went on at 8 o'clock as a reserve. The first time down I had one couché who couldn't stand the pain. He almost drove me crazy with his shrieking and yells of "For God's sake, stop!" And several times when I happened to hit a shell hole or a log accidentally, he actually rose up in his agony and pounded with his bare fists upon the wall of the ambulance. But I knew that I couldn't help him by stopping, and I felt that I might save his life if I hurried. After I got out of Montseville, he quieted down, and I suppose this was because the road was so much smoother. But not until I stopped in front of the hospital at Ville did I learn the truth. The poor fellow had died on the road. Soon after this, Haven and Alan collided in the Bethlehemville woods. I took Jim out in my car to get them in. I left him here with Haven to work on the cars and went on by myself to N. It was certainly an awful night, dark as pitch and a sleety rain blowing into my eyes. However, I got through by God's help, passing Dunham's car, which was laid up with a broken rear axle just outside the woods. I waited 2 hours at the post for Couchet, Tenny and Houston leaving with their loads before me. Some sad cases were brought in while we were waiting. One fellow, with his foot almost severed at the ankle, lay there without a whimper while they amputated it. Another man, with his head caved in like an old cantaloupe, lay beside him. He looked hopeless, but the doctors bandaged him and sent him to Ville. I was doing my best to dodge a couple of shell holes near Straffen's Corner, one of the spots the Boches love to pepper, on my last trip tonight when I overtook a poor courier, walking and pushing his bicycle beside him through the mud. We drivers are not supposed to carry any soldiers, and this wasn't an ideal place to stop. But the poor fellow was dead tired, and I knew if he felt worse than I did, he'd be mighty thankful for a lift. So I pulled on my emergency and yelled to him to throw his bike over the hood and jump in himself if he wanted a ride down to D'Amblay. I left him saying, "Merci, monsieur, merci," outside of the village just at sunrise, and went on to Ville with my blessé. I got back to the cantonment at 6:30, having had no rest for more than 30 hours, and getting something like 5 hours sleep in the last 50. 2 of the men had been on duty at post 2 before, and worked for more than 40 hours without sleep. A wonderful surprise came today, a box from home. Besides a lot of food, which included 20 packages of chewing gum, some crackers, and a 2-pound box of chocolates which disappeared like brancardiers when a shell whistles, there were a dozen magazines, a pair of shoes, a compass which I will probably use more in Paris than out here, and some good photographic paper which I can't get in France. The crackers lasted 5 minutes, the candy until supper time, and I have 1 package of gum left. But no matter how fast the stuff disappeared, it was certainly great fun getting it. March 31, D'Amblay. While I was snoozing comfortably in my car today, Gilmore started the motor and had driven out of the cantonment before I realized what he was doing. I think he wanted to prove to me that a Couchet has no easy ride in one of our ambulances, for he went over curbstones and rock piles and into ditches and shell holes like those which we run into on the N road. The jar was terrific. Sometimes it shook my body all over, and again when we hit a sharp bump like the curb, my feet, along with the whole rear end of the stretcher, were thrown 12 inches into the air and then fell with a crash onto the floor of the car. I wonder what the girls back home would think of the love letter reading contest we had in our room tonight. There were 4 of us there, Eaton, Payne, Fraser, and I, sitting around the fire and having a terrible debate over whether or not the Boston Post had the 2nd largest morning circulation in the country. Eaton swore that it had, because he had worked on it for a month about 5 years ago. He rashly offered 10-to-1 odds, and all 3 of us took him up at 50 francs apiece. We intended to prove it by my almanac, which the family notified me recently had been sent by parcel post. Then the conversation switched to girls, and old Payne claimed he had the most devoted one in all California. Fraser began boasting about this, and before we knew it, they were pulling out their respective letters, and each was trying to prove that his was far more in love with him than the other. Eaton and I were to act as judges. Payne's turned out to be a nice, sensible girl who had just had the measles, and said, "Dear Mart," and "Oh, I wish you were here," and "As ever, yours, Dinah." Fraser's was a bright little thing, very peppy, and with lots of interesting things to say. But she didn't rant much about her love, and couldn't have used the word dear more than 3 or 4 times in the body of the letter. Eaton wouldn't wait long enough to hand out a decision after this. He pulled open one of his own, and it beat the other 2 all hollow. His beloved began with, "Dearest, darling, honey bunchingest, lovey-dovey Robinson," and filled up the whole affair with such absolute nonsense on how she couldn't stand his absence another minute, and how she wanted to fly to him, that we were shrieking with laughter before he had read 5 lines. He got the prize, which happened to be a 40-pound pot of lead melted from shrapnel balls. He can lug it back to America if he wishes. April Fool's Day, midnight, in the Abri at Post 2. I was sent out here exactly 19 hours ago to find Ray Eaton. He had gone to Post 3 2 hours before that, on a special call, and hadn't been heard of since he left there with a load of couchés. Now Bois de Hautecourt is divided into innumerable little squares by dozens of military roads, which lead from battery to battery and from one cantonment to another. Some of them are in a frightful condition, and we figured that Ray had strayed into one of these and gotten stuck. It was just by chance that I found him. I came to a crossroads, turned to the right when I should have kept straight ahead, and discovered his car at the foot of a steep hill. He explained what had happened in a few words. His clutch had given out completely when he started up the hill, and after backing down to the bottom in neutral, he found his reverse wouldn't pull at all. And furthermore, it would have been extremely difficult to have turned around in the dark upon this muddy, narrow road, especially with the load of blessés which he had. Several times during his long wait he had walked back to the main road, thinking one of the other cars might be passing, but none had come, and of course he did not dare to leave his wounded alone for any length of time. I managed to get 464 back-to-back with his machine, and together we changed the couchés. The lower two were easy enough, but it took every ounce of our strength to lift the third blessé up to the top rack of the ambulance. After I had closed the back, I watched Cohen as he tried to climb the hill. Minus the heavy burden, he succeeded in making the ascent, and a minute later disappeared over the crest. After running down to Ville with my load, I came back to Post 3 and then on to 2. By this time it was 6 o'clock, so late that I didn't lie down at all. I put a couple of sticks on the fire and dozed on a stool in front of it until the brancardiers awakened and started their breakfast of bread and coffee. While we were eating, I read a letter which came yesterday from Tony Coucheron, the young artilleryman whom I met in Brillion 6 weeks ago. He had promised then to write to me in English, because he thought it would be easier for me to read. I am quoting it below, for I think it expresses very clearly the feelings of a boy sick and tired of the war. Of course, he has made a number of mistakes in grammar, but considering the short time he studied English, he did remarkably well. Here it is. The 13th of March, the French front. Dear Sir and Friend, I am sure you will forget me for not writing for some week. Here, as you know, we are never free. It is too difficult, and besides we are so tired that we have no courage to write. Now I am on the front, and our guns are not far from the Germans' trenches. I should not tell you news about my life, for you know what it is. Our life, it is sad and dull, and we are awaiting for the end of the war. I am some little happy, for I hope and think the day is at hand. It is too the opinion of the whole part. I long anxiously to return home. My heart aches to be far from my native town. It is a very sweet country with a blue and sunny sky. After the war, I will return home and then end my studies at the Université de Droit of Toulouse. I do not know what your feelings are about what I am saying, but I suppose you also are in a hurry to return home, or for the less to see the war over. Perhaps you wish to go to England or to settle in France. I like very, very our brotherland, and after the war I will spend 3 or 6 months in London. My dear friend, you see that I keep my promises. I have written. Please write often. It is the sincere desire of yours very truly, Tony Coucheron. Photo caption 1. The gasoline locomotive and train of the narrow-gauge railway which carry shells and supplies up to the lines. Photo caption 2. Brancardiers putting a couché stretcher case in the ambulance at St. Thomas. Photo caption 3. 464 and her driver. Directly above the hood, on the wall behind, is posted President Wilson's message of April 2nd, 1917. Photo caption 1. 3 poilus in a front-line trench near St. Thomas. Photo caption 2. A first-line communication trench above St. Thomas. The French have barbed wire stretched overhead to prevent entrance here by the enemy. During the forenoon, I waited around outside the abri, and since no blessés seemed to be forthcoming, I strolled over to an observation tree several hundred yards distant. It was a big beach, more than 60 feet high, and appeared to have a small screened platform in the topmost branches. When I had climbed up about 30 steps, I came to a place where a shell had torn away half of the trunk. But it seemed solid enough, so I took a chance and went on to the top. From here, I could see for miles over the front, beginning with Morcom on the right, then across Hill 304, Avocat, and the surrounding forest, and ending with the plateau above Vauquois. It was wonderfully interesting to me to watch the crude, zigzag lines twisting in and out among the hills and valleys. I was only sorry that I hadn't a pair of field glasses along. They would have made it easier to see the trenches, and some of the 150s, bursting in the valley beyond me, would also have shown up more clearly. McLean, who had been spending the night at Post 3, got a bogus telephone message to come up here for a wounded officer and dropped in about noon. Not a blessé had arrived for hours, so we talked for a while and finally started to dig for fusées and compression bands in the fresh shell holes behind the post. There was one only a few hours old in which we were particularly interested. We hadn't begun to dig before we discovered that a gas shell had fallen here, and it was tear gas at that. Water literally rolled from our eyes, and this was soon followed by an awful choking sensation. We put on our gas masks immediately, and from then on, until we found the base of the shell, buried several feet underground, we didn't remove the masks at all. We had to work very slowly, for the air is filtered through in such small quantities that you can't breathe as you normally do when working. Note: a month later, I carried the steel base, half full of clay, back to D'Amblay, and during all the weeks we stayed here, it never lost its gassy odor. A couple of poilus and I had a grand time trying to say a few simple things to one another tonight. We sat before the fire in the damp abri, where I am now writing, and where the smoke hangs down from the ceiling in a cloud 2 feet thick. You have to crawl on your hands and knees when you move about in the room. While I was getting in deep over some complicated idea which I wanted to impart to them, and was gesticulating wildly to explain it, a brancardier tapped me lightly on the shoulder and said, "Encore de blessés, monsieur." I reluctantly put on my heavy canvas mackinaw and went out into the night. The brancardier had already shoved the stretchers into the car and closed up the back when I arrived. I filled my radiator as usual from my reserve can. It is still so cold that we are obliged to drain the water every time we stop the motor for more than a minute or so. Gave her one twist and started off for Ville. It was frightfully dark in the woods, and every now and then I stopped my car, got out, and looked about to see if I were still on the road. At the first crossroads, I almost ran down a 4-horse artillery caisson. After that, I kept my little tin whistle going pretty steadily, and fully half a dozen times a shrill return came back out of the night when I saw nothing at all. But at the fork near Post 4, my luck failed me. Instead of bearing to the left to go to D'Amblay, I missed the turn entirely and headed in the other direction. When I discovered my error, it was too late to go. I had never been over the road that I was now on, and it was darker than ever. I could only see a few feet beyond the radiator cap, but I remembered from my map that it led to Ressicourt, and I knew that from there on to D'Amblay I could go on the main Verdun-Saint-Manold highway. I drove very slowly, at times not more than 4 miles an hour, until I was safely down the long hill leading into the village. There wasn't a truck, not even a ravitaillement cart on the highway, and I speeded up to 15 miles an hour. I got to D'Amblay without any more trouble. Stopped for a second at the doctor's office to tell the man on call to take my place at Post 2, and set off again for Ville. My eyes were very tired from the strain of constantly peering through the darkness, and so, when I came to the "Éteignez les lumières blanches" sign on the hill outside of Braucourt, this town is about 10 miles from the first lines, and about as close as lights can be used safely, I stopped a minute to throw on my headlights. But in doing so, I took all the pressure off the foot brake, and a few minutes later, when I turned on the switch and the lights illuminated the road ahead, I found the whole car going rapidly backwards down the hill. I jammed on the emergency brake, and all 3 foot pedals, and the car came to an abrupt halt a few feet farther down. I got out of my seat to see where I was, and discovered that the rear wheels of the machine were at the top of the steep bank over which we would have tumbled if we had gone 6 inches further. I made a silent prayer as we started up the hill, thanking God for saving us from disaster. At Ville, I put the patients into the hands of a couple of attendants who carried them into a large waiting room, and after examining the tickets pinned to each of their coats, which gave the nature of the injury, they carried the poor fellows off to their respective wards. Then I went out into the night again and turned old 464 towards Post 2. It was a great treat, riding with my headlights on full blast, and I hated to turn them off again at Brocourt. It became very difficult driving after this, and I was almost sorry that I had used my lights at all, for my eyes had grown accustomed to the glare, and it was fully 5 minutes before I could see the road at all. I got along all right for a mile or so after this, but when I neared the long hill leading down into the village of D'Amblay, my sight failed me completely. The car seemed to be hitting an endless series of great "thank you, ma'ams," which shot the front wheels high up in the air and brought them down with a terrific crash onto the stony road. To save my life, I couldn't see what the trouble was, or what the obstacles blocking the road were. I went pounding on down the hill, hanging onto the wheel for dear life as I bounced from one of these awful things to another. And finally, when a speck of moon peeped out from behind a cloud, I saw what was causing the trouble. There, spread out carefully on each side of the road at intervals of perhaps 25 feet, were piles of crushed rock, 10 or 12 inches high, which the repairers had dumped there. I had been trying to straddle these as I came down, and would have soon run smack into the bank if my old friend, the moon, hadn't appeared. I am back again at Post 2 now, safe and sound, but it is no longer midnight as I headed the first page of today's diary. My watch tells me that I have been writing for 2 hours. I had intended to go to bed after I had finished this, but my good friend Acheron, the brancardier, says no. There are encore de blessés outside.